topic will examine modern Russia and Central Asia, Russia and its former republics after communism. For the objectives, we're going to take a look at the forces that basically determine the distribution of goods and services within free enterprise and communist economic systems and how this pertained to Russia and its republics. And we're going to also analyze current events to understand the physical and human processes that led to the current boundaries and political divisions in the eastern section of Eurasia as well as Central Asia and Transcaucasia. Following the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Russian Communist Party united much of what is the far eastern section of Europe, basically this territory spanning from the Baltic states all the way down to the Ukraine, the Transcaucasian countries of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, as well as the Central Asian countries of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan into one overall union of Soviet socialist republics. The basic idea was that each republic was independent yet connected to Moscow in an attempt to create this worker utopia. Now, at the heart of the USSR was the Communist Party. They imposed strict control over political and social life by outlawing other parties and clamping down on dissent using state police force. Moscow directed all business activity through its command economy, deciding levels of production, work quotas, and citizens' careers. Now, the idea was to basically create this workers' paradise. But one thing about the communist ideology was that it believed everyone essentially had to be the same. So many of the freedoms of choice that we have here in the United States of America that we take for granted were not necessarily extended to different ethnic groups and religious groups within the USSR. Here in Central Asia, as well as in parts of Transcaucasia, there were large groups of Muslim communities, and there were also a number of other ethnic groups. Upwards to about 70 different ethnic groups existed within the USSR. In Transcaucasia and Central Asia, ethnic groups were forced to set aside customs and traditions that the communists disliked. They even tried to outlaw the practice of Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and Orthodox Christianity. Following the defeat of the Nazis and their allies in World War II, the Soviets would then extend this system to many Eastern and Central European countries that they controlled through the Warsaw Pact. But the communist economic system was flawed. Using fear and violence did not end dissent. Instead, what it did is it pushed it underground where it basically festered. So this idea of no free expression as a way of uniting people actually was one of the biggest dividing factors within their society. And this is how the communist state existed all the way from 1917 up until the 1980s, when President Mikhail Gorbachev decided that a change was needed. Basically, one of the other big problems of the communist system was its flawed economy. The communist system could produce goods and services. They were excellent at producing heavy machinery and weaponry and producing one of the largest armies in world history. The problem is that a command economy is not very flexible, and it does not respond to the fluctuating needs within a country that the free enterprise system can do. You know, all the little fluctuations within the supply and the demand of a basic economy, these things can't be met as quickly as a market economy can meet it. So in the 1980s, under President Mikhail Gorbachev, two new policies were followed in an attempt to shore up this failing communist system. And these two policies were perestroika and glasnost. Basically, what perestroika was economic restructuring. What the communists wanted to do was to introduce elements of the free enterprise system within their economy. So things like some private ownership of land and of businesses uh, became acceptable instead of complete and total state ownership of everything. Now, the other policy was glasnost, which translates roughly to openness. And this was the idea of free expression. So, for the very first time, dissent or disagreements by the public with their government could actually be published in Russian newspapers, in the newspapers of Central Asia and Transcaucasia in Eastern Europe. And overall, historians, when they look at perestroika and glasnost, they recognize that, yeah, these were smart policies. In fact, these were some of these policies were very similar to what China started following around the 1970s, also, and they've done so with great success. It's one of the largest economies today. They have a vibrant society. Although there is still dissent there, and the Communist Party still does, lock down much of this dissent in terms of their economic restructuring. They've been very successful. In the case of the communists, though, it was too little too late. And starting in November 1989, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Germany, the communist system began to fall. And within less than 2 years, the Soviet system was over with. It had come to an end. Now, the collapse of the Soviet system came with great optimism as people anticipated new freedoms and opportunities. However, the transition was difficult. When transitioning to a market economy, there were basically two paths that they could have taken. One was a slow and gradual path in which the government would slowly start to sell off some of its state property in a process known as privatization. And they would include in this process enough social programs to make sure that the Russian people themselves were taken care of during this, hectic time. The other one was rapid, a very rapid process of privatization. And when the Soviets began to decide on which policy to follow, they, of course, had to seek loans from Western countries like the United States of America and Western Europe. And these countries basically told them, look, if you want access to our loans, we want to see you do a rapid transition, because they believe that would, although it might be a little bit painful, it would be quick and it would be, much more effective than a slow transition. So this is the route that they took: rapid privatization. So the idea basically was that they would take the state property, take these state businesses, and the communist leadership was going to give all citizens a chance to invest and own, a piece of the communist economy, as it opened up. What happened instead was that you had a small group of high-ranking communist officials that, basically went and they used their positions to buy and sell the property amongst themselves. And this created a very, very small group of ultra-wealthy Russian citizens. And today, Russia is not viewed necessarily as a true democracy or a representative government. Instead, it's considered to be an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is defined as rule by a wealthy elite, a small group of very wealthy individuals and families. They hold all power in terms of politics and economics. And so, going into the 1990s, what did you have? Well, up here at the very, very, very tip top of society, you had the incredibly wealthy, and you had this really small, what we would kind of define as a middle class. And then down here, the vast majority of Russians were stuck in impoverished conditions, in poverty. And one of the biggest challenges that they faced was what was called hyperinflation. So if you take a look at any economy and if you plot price over time, what we'll notice is that prices tend to kind of slowly creep upward. And this happens even in the United States of America. Hyperinflation is when this gets out of hand and prices rapidly increase. So imagine for a moment that you want to go out and you want to buy a brand new game console. So we're going to say you want to go out and buy an Xbox. And let's live in a dream world for a minute. Let's say that the Xbox only costs $500, and you can get it in any store right now without having to wait. Again, we're living in a dream world. The hyperinflation of Russia at times reached as far as 200 to 300%. So Xbox one month would basically cost you $500. The next month, what would that price jump up to? It would jump up to $1,500. Now, on something like an Xbox, you can wait to purchase that. It's not a necessity. But think about something like milk. Right now, you go into a grocery store, you can get a gallon of milk for like $3, and that's for like the really pricey brand. If we're talking about hyperinflation of 300% within a month, you're talking about $9 just for a gallon of milk. And when you think about family budgets, $9 when it comes to gallons of milk, that starts to put a serious, strain on what families can do with their money. So for many families, they had to start making serious decisions. Do we pay the electric bill or do we buy groceries? Do we live in the crime-infested neighborhood with a landlord that doesn't take care of the building just to try to save a little bit of money? Or do we pay an outrageous amount of money for what we would consider like basic housing here in the United States of America? So for many Russians, this meant having to turn to the black market. Now, the black market had existed under communist rule. Most people actually relied on the black market to get most of their goods. But now the black market was coming into Russian society as the main provider of even basic goods and services. And this gave rise to a criminal underworld, if you will, within Russian society that we collectively refer to as the Russian mafia. So there's no one single Russian mafia. It's not like, a bunch of guys that are connected together in one big organization. Instead, what we refer to as the Russian mafia are different organizations and private individual actors throughout society, all engaged in criminal behavior, sometimes linked, sometimes not linked. In the Russian mafia, they saw an opportunity in this new climate of uncertainty. And so they began to engage in human trafficking, the enslavement of, entrapment and enslavement of other human beings. Cybercrime became a major way for these guys to get money, and still is. Today our economy is constantly having to deal with cyber criminals that operate out of this part of the world. They got involved in arms struggling. They got involved in the drug trade. And so this when you have this much criminality within a society, it really disrupts things. It causes a lot of hardship. So these were things that the Russian government had to deal with. They had to deal with a changing economy. They had to deal with, checking the growth of the Russian mafia, this new reality where government was controlled by an oligarchy instead of a communist party. So eventually what will happen is within the Russian government, one individual in particular is going to rise to power, and this guy is Vladimir Putin. So by the end of the 1990s, going into the early 2000s, this guy emerges from power in power. And even though there are term limits, limits on the amount of time that you can serve as premier and president within Russia, what he basically does is if he's the president, he handpicks a premier to lead their legislative branch. And then after his term limit ends, what he'll do is he'll flip roles. He'll take over the premiership and appoint the other guy president, and back and forth and back and forth, until recently when they basically just said, hey, you can, for all practical purposes, be president for life. So the Russians, they had to deal with a lot of changing realities. First off, all those old republics, the Baltic states, including Belarus and Moldova, Transcaucasia, Central Asia, they all broke away from Russia, from the USSR, and became independent countries. In Central Asia and in Transcaucasia, they returned to many of their old ethnic traditions that were suppressed under the Communist Party. Included in this were traditional religions. One of the largest religions is Islam. And among many of these people, they did find people that not only wanted to return to Islam, but a very kind of purist version of Islam known as fundamentalism. Now, not all parts of Central Asia and the Transcaucasus got away from Russia. There were groups controlled by non-Russian ethnic groups that did not want to be part of Russia, but Russia viewed as too valuable to let go of, one of which was Chechnya. And so what happened is, in places like Chechnya, this attempt by the Russian government to lock down these regions and prevent them from breaking away, combined with Islamic fundamentalism to lead to outright conflict between the Russian state and Chechnyan rebels, which has morphed into acts of terrorism by Chechen groups. Now, one of the biggest concern that the international community had, though, was this right here, the international stockpile. At the height of the Cold War between the United States of America and the USSR, both sides had over 2,300 ICBMs. These are those intercontinental ballistic missiles that travel between continents and, erase entire cities. So when Russia fell, most of their ICBMs weren't even in Russia. Instead, what the Soviet Union did is they dotted their country with nuclear missile platforms. A lot of them located out here in Siberia, but then you had a number of them in Kazakhstan and these other republics. And so what the international community had to do is they had to go track down all these weapons. And they had to secure, all these stockpiles of nuclear arms. They had to try to stockpile all these conventional arms. And that's not to include like their nuclear power plant, materials. And one of the biggest concerns of the international community that these, weapons, these nuclear weapons, would end up like many of the basic regular military weapons that the Russian army had, the Red Army had, which was, being funneled into the black market, into the arms trade. Because you had a number of like these members of the Russian military that after communism fell, what did they do? Well, they started lining their pockets by basically illegally selling a lot of these weapons on the black market. And so, the international community, they were really interested in tracking all this down to keep that from happening with nuclear bombs. Now, by the 2000s, Russia and its former republics had recovered from the collapse, but it left tensions with Western states, especially the United States. Keep in mind, it was the U.S. and their allies that pushed for that very rapid and very painful transition from communism to free enterprise. Under the leadership of former KGB officer Vladimir Putin, Russia's been intent on reasserting itself on the global stage. And today, it remains a major political, military, and economic power in the region as it charts a course for the 21st century.